Hi, fifth graders. We are going to continue reading the story, The True Confessions of Charlotte Doyle today. We read chapter 1 yesterday, and many of you wrote responses to the question about how women and children were treated in 1832, and there was a lot of good evidence about that used, but women and children were not taken as seriously as men were, and a lot of times treated like they didn't have very good ideas, or they weren't almost like they weren't smart enough to make decisions or do things that men were viewed being able to do. So very distasteful behavior towards men or towards women and children. So that was in 1832, and in chapter 1 yesterday, we saw Charlotte and Mr. Grummage travel to the Seahawk, which is the ship, and the porters were the guys who were carrying Charlotte's trunk, and they feared the captain. They ran away when they realized that they were going to the Seahawk and they were going to see the captain. So Charlotte then learned that the families she was supposed to travel with were not going to be coming on the ship. So she figured out that she was going to be traveling alone with the captain and the crew. And that's where we left off. Okay, chapter 2. With Mr. Grummage leading the way, I stepped finally hesitantly upon the deck of the Seahawk. A man was waiting for us. He was a small man. Most seafaring men are small. Barely taller than I, and dressed in a frayed green jacket over a white shirt that was none too clean. His complexion was weathered dark, his chin ill-shaven, so he had a scruffy chin. His mouth was unsmiling. His fingers fidgeted and his feet shuffled. His darting, unfocused eyes, set deep in a narrow, ferret-like face, gave the impression of one who was constantly on watch for threats that might appear from any quarter at any moment. "Miss Doyle," Mr. Grummage intoned by way of introduction. "Both Captain Jaggery and the first mate are ashore. May I present the second mate, Mr. Keach." "Miss Doyle," this Mr. Keach said to me, speaking in an unnecessarily loud voice, "since Captain Jaggery isn't aboard, I've no choice but to stand in his place. But it's my strong opinion, miss, that you should take another ship for your passage to America." "And I," Mr. Grummage cut in before I could respond, "can allow of no such thing." This was hardly the welcome I expected. "But, Mr. Grummage," I said, "I'm sure my father would not want me to be traveling without—" Mr. Grummage silenced my objections with an upraised hand. "Miss Doyle," he said, "my orders were clear and allow for no other construction. I met you. I brought you here. I had you placed under the protection of this man who, in the momentary absence of Captain Jaggery and the first mate, fulfilled his obligation by signing a receipt for you." So they almost treated her like she was a package they were receiving instead of a human. To prove his point, Mr. Grummage waved a piece of paper at me. I might have been a bale of cotton. "Therefore, Miss Doyle," he rushed on, "nothing remains save to wish you a most pleasant voyage to America." Putting actions to words, he tipped his hat, and before I could utter a syllable, he strode down the gangplank toward the shore. "But Mr. Grummage," I called desperately. Whether Mr. Grummage heard me or chose not to hear me, he continued to stride along the dock without so much as a backward glance. I was never to see him again. A slight shuffling sound made me turn about. Beneath a lantern on the forecastle deck, I saw a few wretched sailors hunched in an ape-like posture, pounding oakum between the decking planks. Without a doubt, they had heard everything. Now they threw hostile glances over their shoulders in my direction. I felt a touch at my elbow. Starting, or being surprised, I turned again and saw Mr. Keach. He seemed more nervous than ever. "Begging your pardon, Miss Doyle," he said in his awkward way. "There's nothing to be done now, is there? I'd best show you to your cabin." At that point, I remembered my trunk of clothing, as if that collection of outward fashion, still ashore, had more to claim to me than the ship. And since it was there, so should I be. "My trunk," I murmured, making a half-turn toward the dock. "Not to worry, miss. We'll fetch it for you," Mr. Keach said, cutting off my last excuse for retreat. Indeed, he held out a lantern indicating an entryway in the wall of the quarterdeck that appeared to lead below. What could I do? All my life I had been trained to obey, educated to accept. I could hardly change in a moment. "Please lead me," I mumbled, as near to fainting as one could be without actually succumbing. "Very good, miss," he said, leading me across the deck and down the short flight of steps. I found myself in a narrow passage with a low ceiling. The steerage, as this area is called, was hardly more than 6 feet wide and perhaps 30 feet in length. In the dimness, I could make out a door on each side, one door at the far end. Like a massive tree rising right out of the floor and up through the ceiling was the main mast. There was also a small table attached to the center of the flooring. No chairs. The whole area was frightfully confining, offering no sense of comfort that I could see, and the stench of rot permeated the air. "This way," I heard Mr. Keach say again. He had opened a door on my left. "Your cabin, miss, the one contracted for." A gesture invited me to enter. I gasped. The cabin was but 6 feet in length. So think about that. 6 feet is like how far you have to stand away from each other when you are talking to somebody else right now or near somebody else. Like, that is not very far. That's not very long. And that's how long her cabin is. 4.5 feet high, 4 feet wide. I, none too tall, could only stoop to see in. "Regular passengers pay a whole £6 for this, miss," Mr. Keach advised me, his voice much softer. I forced myself to take a step into the cabin. Against the opposite wall, I could make out a narrow shelf, partly framed by boarding. When I noticed something that looked like a pillow and a blanket, I realized it was meant to be a bed. Then, when Mr. Keach held up the light, I saw something crawl over it. "What's that?" I cried. "Roach, miss. Every ship has 'em." As for the rest of the furnishings, there was none save a small built-in chest in the bulkhead wall, the door of which drooped down and served as a desktop. There was nothing else. No porthole, that's like a window, so no window. No chair, not so much as a single piece of polite ornamentation. It was ugly, unnatural, and as I stooped there, impossible. In a panic, I turned toward Mr. Keach, wanting to utter some new protest. Alas, he had gone and had shut the door behind him as though to close the spring on a trap. How long I remained hunched in that tiny dark hole, I am not sure. What aroused me was a knock on the door. Startled, I gasped, "Come in." The door opened. Standing there was a shockingly decrepit old sailor, a tattered, tar-covered hat all but crushed in his gnarled and trembling hands. His clothing was poor, his manner cringing. "Yes," I managed to say. "Miss, your trunk is here." I looked beyond the door to the trunk's bulky outline. I saw at once how absurd it would be to even attempt to bring it in my space. The sailor understood. "She's too big, isn't she?" he said. I think so." "Best put it up in top cargo," he offered, "right below. You can always fetch things there, miss." "Yes, top cargo," I echoed without knowing what I was saying. "Very good, miss," the man said, and then he pulled his forelock as a signal of obedience and compliance to a suggestion that he had made himself. But instead of going, he just stood there. "Yes?" I asked miserably. "Begging your pardon, miss," the man murmured, his look more hangdog than ever. "Barlow's the name, and thought it's not my business or place to tell you, miss. Some of the others here, jack tars like myself, have deputized me to say that you shouldn't be on this ship, not alone as you are, Not this ship, not this voyage, miss. So they kind of, the rest of the crew like appointed him to go tell her that she should not come on the ship. What do you mean? I said, frightened anew. Why would they say that? Your being here will lead to no good, miss. No good at all. You'd be better off far from the Seahawk. Though all my being agreed with him, my training, that it was wrong for a man of his low station to presume to advise me of anything, rose to the surface. I drew myself up. Mr. Barlow, I said stiffly, it's my father who has arranged it all. Very good, miss, he said, pulling at his forelock again. But I but done my duty, which is what I'm deputized to do. And before I could speak further, he scurried off. I wanted to run after him to cry, yes, for God's sake, get me off this ship. But again, there was nothing in me that allowed such behavior. Indeed, I was left with a despairing resolve never to leave the cabin until we reached America. Steadfastly, I shut my door. By doing so, I made the space completely dark, and I quickly moved to keep it open. I was exhausted and desired greatly to sit down, but there was no place to sit. My next thought was to lie down, trying to put the notions of vermin out of my mind. Vermin is like mice and rats and things like that. I made a move toward my bed, but discovered that it was too high for me to reach easily in my skirts. Then suddenly I realized that I must relieve myself, so she had to go to the restroom. But where was I to go? I had not the slightest idea. If you will be so kind to recollect that during my life I had never once, not for a moment, been without the support, guidance, and protection of my elders, you will accept my words as being without exaggeration when I tell you that at that moment I was certain I had been placed in a coffin, my coffin. It's hardly to be wondered then that I burst into tears, crying with fear, rage, and humiliation. I was still stooped over crying when yet another knock came on the door. Attempting to stop my tears, I turned about to see an old black man who, in the light of the little lantern he was holding, looked like the very imp of death in search of souls. His clothing, what I could see of it, was even more decrepit, or more like tattered and torn, than the previous sailors, which is to say mostly rags and tatters. His arms and legs were as thin as spikes. His face, as wrinkled as a crumpled napkin, was flecked with the stubble of a white beard. His tightly curled hair was thin, his lips were slack, his teeth were missing. When he smiled, for that is what I assumed he was attempting, he offered only a scattering of stumps. But his eyes seemed to glow with curiosity and were all the more menacing because of it. Yes, I managed to say. At your service, Miss Doyle. The man spoke with a surprisingly soft, sweet voice. And wondering if you might not like a bit of tea. I have my own special store, and I'm prepared to offer some. So this man had stored some tea, and he was offering to share it with her. It was the last thing I expected to hear. That's very kind of you, I stammered in surprise. Could you bring it here? The old man shook his head gently. If Miss Doyle desires tea, captain's orders, she must come to the galley. Galley? Kitchen to you, miss. Who are you? I demanded faintly. Zachariah, he returned. Cook, surgeon, carpenter, and preacher to man and ship. And all those things to you, too, miss, in that complete order. Now, then, shall you have tea? So often on ships, some of the members of the crew had a lot of different jobs, and it would be really crazy to you guys that to see some of these jobs that they had because they did things like doctors would do, but they might be a blacksmith, where they made iron, So this guy was a cook, so he made the food. He was a surgeon, so he fixed people up when they got hurt or when they were sick. He was a carpenter, so he fixed things on the ship and built things. And he was a preacher, so he was like a religious leader on the ship. So 4 very different jobs, but this guy had all of those jobs. In fact, the thought of tea was extraordinarily comforting, a reminder the world I knew had not entirely vanished. I couldn't resist. Very well, I said. Would you lead me to the galley? Most assuredly, was the old man's reply. Stepping away from the door, he held his lantern high. I made my way out. We proceeded to walk along the passageway to the right, then up the short flight of steps to the waist of the ship, that low deck area between fore and quarter deck. Here and there lanterns glowed, masts, spars, and rigging vaguely sketched the dim outlines of the net in which I felt caught. I shuddered. The man called Zachariah led me down another flight of steps into what appeared to be a fairly large area. In the dimness I could make out piles of sails as well as extra rigging, all chaotically and unspeakably filthy. Then, off to one side, I saw a small room. The old man went to it, started to enter, but paused and pointed to a small adjacent door that I had not noticed. The head, miss. The what? Privy. My cheeks burned. Even so, never have I felt secretly so grateful. So the privy is another word for the bathroom. Without a word, I rushed to use it. In moments I returned. Zachariah was waiting patiently. Without further ado, he went into the galley. I followed with trepidation, stopping at the threshold to look about. From the light of his flickering lantern, I could see that it was a small kitchen complete with cabinets, wood stove, even a table and a little stool. The space, though small, had considerable neatness, with utensils set in special niches and corners. Niches are like little tiny spots, little places to put things. Knives placed just so, an equal number of spoons and forks, tumblers, pots, cups, pans, all that was needed. The old man went right to the stove where the teapot was already on, hot enough to be issuing steam. So it seems like Charlotte really likes this Zachariah. He seems really nice and kind, and he also seems like he has things kind of in an order, so I bet that makes her feel a little bit safer on the ship. Nothing, however, could have compelled me to enter further. Though stiff and weary, I preferred to stand where I was. Even so, I tasted the tea and was much comforted. As I drank, Zachariah looked at me. It may well be, he said softly, that Miss Doyle will have use for a friend. Finding the suggestion from him unpleasant, I chose to ignore it. I can assure you, he said with a slight smile, Zachariah can be a fine friend. And I can assure you, I returned, that the captain will have made arrangements for my social needs. So she's kind of being a little snotty about this because Zachariah is being very nice to her. But that was kind of like the way of a person in her standing, like in her social standing in 1832. So she kind of thought that she was above, in a social class above Zachariah. Ah, but you and I have much in common. I don't think so. But we do, Miss Doyle. Miss Doyle is so young. I am so old. Surely there is something similar in that. And you, the sole girl, and I, the one black man, are special on this ship. In short, we begin with two things in common, enough to begin a friendship. So he's saying even though they're really different, he's older, she's young, he's a black man, she's a white girl. What they have in common is that he's much older than the rest of the crew, she's much younger. He is the only man of the crew who's black. She is the only person in the crew who is a female. So, or person among the crew who is a female. So that's why he's saying they have a lot in common. I looked elsewhere. I don't need a friend, I said. One always needs a final friend. Final friend? Someone to sew the hammock, he returned. I do not understand you. When a sailor dies on voyage, miss, he goes to his resting place in the sea with his hammock sewn about him by a friend. I swallowed my tea hastily, handed the cup back, and made a move to go. Miss Doyle, please, he said softly, taking the cup but holding me with his eyes. I have something else to offer. No more tea, thank you. No, miss, it is this. He held out a knife. With a scream, I jumped back. No, Miss Doyle, don't misunderstand. I only wish to give you the knife as protection in case you need it. He placed a wooden sheath on the blade and held it out. The knife was, as I came to understand, what's called a dirk, D-I-R-K. A small dagger-like blade, hardly more than 6 inches in length from its white scrimshaw handle, where a star design was cut, to its needle-sharp point. Horrified, I was capable only of shaking my head. Miss Doyle doesn't know what might happen, he urged, as though suggesting it might rain on a picnic and he was offering a head covering. I know nothing about knives, I whispered. A ship sails with any wind she finds, he whispered. Take it, miss. Place it where it may be reached. So saying, he took my hand and closed my fingers over the dirk. Cringing, I kept it. Yes, he said with a smile, patting my fingers. Now Miss Doyle may return to her cabin. Do you know the way? I'm not certain. I will guide you. He left me at my door. Once inside, I hurriedly stowed the dirk under the thin mattress, resolving never to look at it again, and somehow struggled into my bed. There, fully dressed, I sought rest, fitfully dozing, only to be awakened by a banging sound, my cabin door swinging back and forth, rusty hinges rasping with the gentle sway of the ship. Then I heard, "The only one I could get to come, sir, is the Doyle girl, and with them looking on, I had to put on a bit of a show about wanting to keep her off. Quite all right, Mr. Keach. If there has to be only one, she's the trump. With her as a witness, they'll not dare to move. I'm well satisfied." "Thank you, sir." Their voices trailed away. So they're talking about her, and they are saying that they kept her coming on the ship and pretended like they didn't want her to come on. So that's interesting. For a while, I tried to grasp what I heard, but I gave it up as incomprehensible, so she didn't understand. Then, for what seemed like forever, I lay listening as the Seahawk, tossed by the ceaseless swell, heaved and groaned like a sleeper beset by evil dreams. At last I slept, only to have the ship's dreams become my own. So we're going to stop there. I know I said we were going to read chapters 2 and 3. I meant just chapter 2 because they're kind of long chapters. So if you're following along in a book, we are on page 25 for next time on chapter 3. And I put my bookmark in there. And then you will have a discussion question to do on Schoology. So please read that and respond. And remember, if you don't want to respond in the comments, you can submit it as an assignment if you just want me to read it. Otherwise, if you put it in the comments, everybody can read it. And then what I expect is that any comments that are made, you guys can comment on each other's and have a discussion, but all of that discussion needs to be positive and encouraging, just like the things that we've all talked about in our charters, okay? So we'll start up with chapter 3 next time, and we'll go over what's happened so far in the True Confessions of Charlotte Doyle. Okay, see you next time.